My name is Chuck Dooley. I'm with the Illinois Department of Commerce. Today we're going to talk about personally identifiable information. One thing to keep in mind is that there are different laws and regulations related to PII. There are even different terms and definitions for PII, including personal information. But today we're going to focus on the Department of Labor's Training and Employment Guidance Letter number 3911. That TEGL was issued back in 2012 and has been in effect for several years now. In addition to the Department of Labor's TEGL, there are other regulations and laws related to PII. For example, there are Illinois state laws including the Identity Protection Act and the Personal Information Protection Act. The Identity Protection Act outlines the requirements for state and local governments related to Social Security numbers. For example, state and local governments are prohibited from displaying or posting Social Security numbers. The Personal Information Protection Act requires notification to Illinois residents of security breaches that result in disclosure of PII. In addition, there's also the WIOA final rule at 20 CFR 683.220, which requires recipients and subrecipients of WIOA Title I funds have an internal control structure and written policies in place to protect PII and sensitive information. In addition to that, there is the Federal Uniform Guidance, which requires grantees and sub-grantees take reasonable measures to safeguard protected personally identifiable information and other information the federal awarding agency or the pass-through entity designates as sensitive. And then last of all would be your employer's own policies and procedures. Like I've already mentioned, the WIOA final rule requires WIOA recipients and subrecipients to have written procedures related to PII. And then DOL's TEGL 3911 also requires that DOL ETA grantees have policies and procedures in place under which personnel, before being granted access to PII, acknowledge their responsibilities for safeguarding data. Like I mentioned previously, there are different terms and definitions for PII, including personal information. We're going to focus on the DOL definition of PII, which is information that can be used to distinguish or trace an individual's identity, either alone or when combined with other personal information that is linked or linkable to a specific individual. And there's a similar definition of PII in the Federal Uniform Guidance. There are two types of PII classified based on risk of harm to an individual. First of all, there's protected PII, which is information that, if disclosed, could result in harm to an individual. And then there's non-sensitive PII, which is information that, if disclosed by itself, cannot reasonably be expected to result in personal harm. One other category I want to address is sensitive PII, because it's mentioned throughout the TEGL. And sensitive PII includes protected PII related to individuals, but it also includes any unclassified information whose loss, misuse, or unauthorized access could adversely affect the interests of the program. So not only would it include personal PII, but it would also include organizational data. Examples of types of PII. For protected PII, that would include Social Security numbers, credit card numbers, home telephone numbers, and birth dates. Non-sensitive PII would include first and last names, business addresses, and business telephone numbers. One thing to keep in mind is that protected PII or non-sensitive PII linked to protected PII could result in harm to an individual. A name, for example, linked to a Social Security number or a birth date. I'm going to briefly summarize the requirements in Teagle 3911. The overall requirement is that PII and other sensitive information must be protected. And specifically, you should not email sensitive PII unless it is encrypted. And you may not store sensitive PII on portable drives or media unless it is encrypted. One thing I want to mention is that the Teagle 3911 does address the federal information processing standards that apply to PII. And it's FIPS 140-2 for short. There's even, the Teagle even includes a website where you can review those standards. So anything used for encryption, any software solutions or anything else used for encryption must meet federal security standards. One thing I want to mention is that based on my research, third-party cloud storage providers such as Google Drive and Dropbox, which are commonly used by grantees, do not meet the federal security standards in FIPS 140-2. And the main reason for that is because the data is not encrypted before it's uploaded to the cloud storage provider. So the cloud storage provider is able to decrypt the data and even conduct data mining on the data on the cloud storage platform. So that's something to keep in mind. You can still use Google Drive and Dropbox for transmitting data. However, you can't use it for transmitting PII under DOL grants. So the best solution would be to not email PII or to mask the PII on the document before it's emailed. Other DOL requirements: don't access or store PII data on personally owned equipment at off-site locations. So for example, don't log into IWDS from your home computer. Don't store sensitive PII on portable drives or media unless it's encrypted. And any access to any PII created by the ETA grant must be restricted to only those employees who need it in their official capacity to perform duties in connection with the scope of work in the grant agreement. So not only do the PII requirements apply to disclosure of PII, but they also apply to the use of PII. PII must not be used for unauthorized activities unrelated to the grant scope of work. If Social Security numbers are used, they must be stored or displayed in a way that is not attributable to a specific individual. PII data must be stored in an area that is physically safe from access by unauthorized personnel, and PII may not be downloaded to or maintained on mobile or portable devices unless it is encrypted. In addition, wage data may only be accessed from secure locations. Some common sense measures in implementing the requirements in the Teagle include the following. Mask PII on all documents before emailing if the information is not encrypted. Do not leave records containing PII unattended on your desk. Don't leave PII at the copier, the printer, or the fax machine. Don't discard PII in the trash. Use shredders or locked recycling bins. And store records with PII in secured cabinets and other secured areas. Return participant files to their proper area or keep in a secure place, for example, a locked filing cabinet or storage room. Redact PII before making copies or uploading or storing documents with sensitive information. And do not write the password to your laptop on your laptop. So those are all common sense measures that you can take to implement the requirements in the Teagle in your own work. One thing to keep in mind is that this not only protects our participants, and our employers in the program, but it also protects our own information because these requirements also apply to employee data. So, for example, a local area may have subrecipients and may have access to employee data for the subrecipients. Data security measures, and your organization may have its own policies and procedures and its own measures, but these are some common sense data security measures you should take to implement the PII requirements. First of all, do not share your username and password. Do not share access to system accounts, including GRS, IWDS, JobLink, Illinois WorkNet, and IBIZ. Do not link unauthorized hardware to the state network. For example, hooking up a wireless router to a state landline. That would apply more to state employees, but the same would hold true for grantees and sub-grantees. They shouldn't hook up wireless routers to their to a network connection. And notify network administrator when employees are separated or suspended from employment, so their access to PII can be terminated. Only use system accounts for authorized business purposes. Do not download and install programs or software from the internet unless you're authorized to do so. Do not open suspicious emails, especially phishing emails. I know at work, through my work email, I receive phishing emails where the sender's email address is disguised to look like somebody else's email address. And I even get that in my own personal email. So that's something you want to be aware of. Do not open suspicious emails and do not click on links in suspicious emails. Always lock your workstation when away from your desk. Do not store PII on zip drives, CDs, and other portable media. Like I mentioned, these requirements not only serve to protect our participants and employers and the program, but they also serve to protect us. According to Title 3911, there are civil and criminal penalties for noncompliance with the safeguards contained in federal and state laws. And employees who discard or misuse PII may be subject to disciplinary action in accordance with their employer's own personnel policies. I know at the state of Illinois, our PII policy is incorporated into our employee manual, and then the employee manual is presented to new employees as part of the onboarding process, and then they sign off that they've read the employee manual and the other documents in the onboarding package. That concludes our presentation on PII. It is a very short webinar. We were thinking of piggybacking it on another webinar, but that didn't work out. However, it is an important topic, and it does deserve its own webinar. It just wasn't going to fill up the 90-minute time slot. However, I don't think there are going to be any complaints about that. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions either in the chat room or over the phone, if you have any. I'm looking at a question right now. Would activating password protection...
Your microphone has been turned on.
I'm looking at that question right now. Would activating password protection to view a file count as encryption? No, that probably would not. I know that Microsoft Outlook has an option to encrypt files. You have to have a user key, and if you try to encrypt the file without a user key, then it's going to give you an error message. So basically with encryption, what that entails, and I'm not an IT person, so you should probably consult with your IT staff about this, but normally with encryption, there's a user key, and when the information is emailed, it's undecipherable until it's decrypted on the other end. There's another question in the chat room. We do a lot of traveling case management because of our rural makeup. Can we log into IWDS on a library Wi-Fi or a school's Wi-Fi, or is this something that would go against these rules using a work laptop? I would recommend talking to your IT staff about this, or your IT consultant if you don't have IT staff. But I would definitely not log on to a Wi-Fi that is not password protected or secured. If it's password protected, we think that you would be able to do that. Another question is, would a person's email be considered protected or non-sensitive? I think in the ordinary course of your duties that your email messages would be considered non-sensitive. The one thing I want to emphasize is that PII would be not necessarily refers to the means of communication, but the information that is included in the email or in the document that's being emailed. So if you have a list of participants that include names and social security numbers, that would definitely be PII. And in that case, I would either not email that information, or I would make sure that it's encrypted before emailing it. And if you have any doubts about being able to encrypt the email, then I would refer to your IT staff, or I would just refrain from doing it in the first place, and maybe sending the document with all the PII redacted or masked. Like I mentioned earlier, DOL has very specific requirements for encryption, so you have to make sure that it meets those requirements, the FIPS 140-2 requirements, and in a lot of cases, cloud storage providers like Dropbox, which are used frequently, even though I think there is some encryption of data on Dropbox, it doesn't meet the requirements in the TEAGL, the federal security standards in the TEAGL. There is another question. Citrix ShareFile is a HIPAA-approved file and email encryption application. Will there be a list of approved file encryption applications provided? And I probably didn't mention this earlier, but there is a list on the internet of validated encryption solutions and vendors. If you Google Federal Information Processing Standards 140-2, you should be able to find a list of validated vendors and solutions on the first page. And then they're categorized by year, so you can click on the tab for 2016 to review the current list. And I reviewed the list. I did not see Dropbox or Google Drive on the list, but there may be other solutions that appear on the list. I don't know specifically about Citrix ShareFile. I know that there are various security standards, and that Dropbox and some other sharing solutions, file sharing solutions, do meet certain encryption standards, but they have to, in order to be used for transmitting PII for DOL grants, they have to meet the federal information processing standards that are referenced in the TEAGL. And then There was another question. Is it okay to email a customer's name and last 4 digits of the Social Security number? And that would be acceptable. The TEGL says that if you do email or use PII, specifically Social Security numbers, then the Social Security number should be truncated or masked, at least partially. And that's what we do in IWDS. All but the last 4 numbers of the participant Social Security number is masked in IWDS. So I would say that would be acceptable. And I believe Jim Potts is on the line today, so if Jim wants to add anything about that, Jim, feel free to do so. But yeah, it's my understanding that that's acceptable.
I'm not the authority on this, but we do it often ourselves when we're getting information with the field. One of the things I would like to bring up for P2, some of the things that went on for IWS, you'll notice the reports, there's no longer a full SOCH on any of the reports. If you ever find a case where there is, please bring it to our attention. Also, there's no longer the ability to search by a full SOCH, so you want to do a good partial search. And also, it used to, the SOCH would appear on the application definition screen at the beginning. It's no longer there. It's on the private information screen. So a lot of times people will start an application and then realize that there's a duplicate SOCH in there. So it's a really good, important thing to do that search at the customer level by things like last 4 and birth dates, last 4 and partial first name, things like that just for your search. And those are all put in for P2 criteria. So that's basically all I have to say about it.
Thanks, Jim. There's another question regarding email addresses. Is a person's email address considered PII? And I would say no, because, for example, if you send a person an email, the email address is going to be in the header of the email anyway. So I would say that would not be considered PII. I think if you refer to the TEGL, there's a more comprehensive list of examples of protected PII and non-sensitive information in there. And I listed a few, the more obvious ones like the Social Security number and the birth date. I know I've read that if you have a person's name and birth date, that can be used to commit identity theft. So yeah, the more obvious examples of PII would be the Social Security number, sensitive financial information like the credit card number or bank account number, which we wouldn't normally have anyway, and also the birth date, just to name a few. And like I said, there are other examples in the TEGL, and then your own organization's policies and procedures may list additional ones. Are there any other questions related to this? Like I mentioned, there are a lot of sources of requirements related to PII. The most significant one for WIOA grants and trade grants would be the TEGL 3911, which came out in 2012. And even in the TEGL, if you look at the last page, or the last 2 pages of the TEGL, it even lists additional federal laws and requirements related to PII upon which the TEGL was based. And a lot of those, however, apply only to federal agencies and employees. For example, they mention the Privacy Act. But the main requirements that we work under would be in TEGL 3911. Are there any questions over the phone, or does anybody else have any questions that they want to enter in the chat room? Oh, There's another question. A comment was made not to use IWDS on a home computer. If IWDS is FIPS compliant, why can't we use IWDS on a home computer? Yeah, the reason that that IWDS, well, first of all, I should clarify that IWDS wouldn't necessarily be FIPS compliant. When we're talking about FIPS compliance, as explained in the Teagle, that applies primarily to vendor solutions and vendors, validated vendors for encryption. IWDS doesn't have anything to do with encryption. That's a proprietary system used by the Department of Commerce for WIOA case management. So it's not FIPS compliant. FIPS compliance refers mainly to the method used for encryption. I mentioned that Dropbox would not be FIPS compliant, and the reason that you shouldn't use portable devices or home computers to access IWDS is because that could, you're outside of the network, and there's a greater risk of a security breach if you're accessing IWDS not using your employer's computer. If you're using a laptop, that should be acceptable. If you're using a work laptop that's used for work purposes, that would be acceptable. However, if you're using a personal computer, that would not be acceptable, and that's spelled out explicitly in the Teagle. They mention unauthorized hardware and software, or personal hardware and software, and portable drives and media, which are prohibited from being used for accessing PII under DOL grants. So yeah, I'm glad I got the opportunity to clarify that. IWDS is not FIPS compliant any more than your email or any other applications that you use.
Hey Chuck, it's Mark Burgess. Good morning, and thanks for the webinar. I wanted to check to ensure that, I don't know if Scarlett or Christy Jones mentioned when the next webinar was. We initially had talked about having a webinar next week, but in reconsidering that, we are not going to have a webinar on the 11th. Rather, we'll have one on the 18th. And so for everyone listening in on this webinar, that topic will be kind of twofold. The first half will be on one-stop certification, or I'm sorry, one-stop procurement. And then the other half of that will be one-stop certification criteria. We've got a work group going on right now creating that criteria document, and we should formalize that more after our next meeting this Friday. And so we want to make sure we invite local boards and CEOs to a webinar, and we didn't think that 1 week would be enough time to get them to have maximum participation in their schedule. So we're going to have that on the 18th, so I apologize if previously was mentioned that it would be held on the 11th. So mark your calendars that the next webinar on a WIOA Wednesday webinar will be the 18th on one-stop procurement and one-stop certification criteria.
At what time?
Okay.
10 o'clock for an hour
It'll
and
be
a half?
the same 10. It'll be the same 10 o'clock. And because of it being two topics, it probably will take up at least the entire 1.5, if not 2 hours that we generally set aside for these. We just wanted to do it together because we will be bringing in people from the boards and CEOs, and would rather just utilize their time once instead of two separate webinars. And it'll be, we'll send out a reminder like we normally do shortly after this one, either later today or tomorrow, so that everyone will know that time and the date for certain and those topics, and then we'll get the documents out as we normally do a day or two ahead of time.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if there are any, yeah, there are a few more questions in the chat room. I want to mention a couple more things. A detailed discussion of the FIPS requirements, the federal security standards for encryption, would be beyond the scope of this webinar, but those requirements, along with the website, are referenced in the TEAGL. So if you have any questions, there's a website regarding the FIPS requirements in the TEAGL, and you can refer to that website for more information. And I believe it even has contact email addresses that you can email for additional information. And like I mentioned previously, there's also on the internet a list of validated vendors that meet the federal security standards. And some of them include, for example, Microsoft. So, you know, you could refer to those websites and also refer to your own IT staff for additional information. But short of that, the best precaution to take would be simply not to email PII, or if you do email documents with PII, make sure that the PII in the document is masked or hidden. There are a few more questions in the chat room. Who do I need to contact to make sure I am on the contact list? I don't know if that refers to the ETA training and employment guidance letters, but if you go to the DOL ETA website, you can subscribe to the TEAGLs. You go to the, and I think most of the local areas, a lot of their staff are already subscribed to the TEAGLs, but if you're not already subscribed, you can go to the ETA website and subscribe, and you should be specific in what information you want sent to you. Another question is, oh, this is an FYI. There may be an on-site training meeting on GATA on January 18. Might want to coordinate. Yeah, needless to say, PII is involved in everything we do. I don't know that the date for the training on the 18th is solid yet. I haven't seen an invitation. But yeah, if you have any questions, you can always refer to this webinar because it's being recorded. And like I said, you could also refer to the TEAGL, or if you have any questions, you could email me, and I could find out the answer for you. And then Mike Williams included a link to a website. I think that is the list of the validated vendors, the validated vendors that meet the federal security standards for encryption. Oh, and then there was another question about how to get on the list for the webinars. Okay, then, yeah, I see Christy Jones already answered that question. To be added to the webinar list, please email Christy Jones at the email address in the chat pod. I'm going to quickly scan the chat room to see if there are any other questions we missed. And regarding going back to the accessing IWDS on home computers, I'm on the slide which summarizes the DOL requirements in TEAGL 3911, and that specifically states don't access or store PII data on personally owned equipment at off-site locations. And I'm sure the reasoning behind that is that personally owned equipment may have viruses or malware on it and could compromise the security of not only the IWDS but also the network, the employer's network. So it's just a greater risk if you use personally owned equipment. Like I said, probably a better alternative would be to use a work laptop to access that information out in the field or off-site. Are there any other questions? Okay, if there are, I don't see any other questions in the chat room. So that concludes our webinar. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. This is a really important topic. Like I said, this webinar will be archived. So if you have staff or partners who need to see this information, then they'll be able to access the archived webinar at a later date. And then, like I said, most of this information can also be found in Teagle 3911, and they should also refer to your organization's own policies and procedures related to PII. So if there aren't any other questions, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. And like Mark Burgess mentioned, there's going to be a webinar soon on one-stop procurement. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.